Most of you know me. For those of you that don't, I'm Ed Friedman. I chair Friends of Merry Meeting Bay. So I really want to thank CC Doucette here, who was gracious enough to come up on short notice and be tonight's speaker. I think CC's specialty is more wireless in schools and alternative methods of safe technology, but she's going to talk about wildlife as well because we are an environmental organization.
Thank you everybody for coming out tonight. As Ed mentioned, my name is CC Doucette and I'm from Ashland, Massachusetts. And about 5 or 6 years ago, I really had no idea that wireless was something that we should be concerned with. In fact, we kept hearing about the 21st century classroom in our schools, and I was helping to run our education foundation at the time, so we jumped in to try and get all this great new technology that we were hearing our kids were going to need to succeed in life. And then I went on to become the grant coordinator in our schools, and I ran our government grants, but then I heard about Donors Choose, which is crowdfunding for teachers. And I thought, well, there's an opportunity because our budgets have been cut to the bone. So I promoted that, and we got over 100 projects funded, and we got wonderful things like iPads and Chromebooks and minis and Apple TVs and smart boards. And then at book group one night, a girlfriend of mine who's an electrical engineer was reading a book called Zapped. And she inferred that there could be something up biologically with wireless. And I just made a mental note of it, and then something crossed my path not long after that in writing, and I went, wow, if there's anything to this, I would like to know because I've worked very hard to bring this technology in. So I was finding things like the French National Library took wireless out in 2008 because of the health risks. Pockets in Belgium and Italy and Israel were removing it from their schools. So I'm passing all this out to my schools, to my superintendent, our school committee, our principals, our science teachers, our nurses, anybody who might listen. And I got back crickets. And I think it wasn't until they read the fine print that comes with all of our devices that they had an uh-oh moment. Does anybody with us tonight have an iPhone on you? Okay. If you could take out the iPhone, and I want to walk you through where that legal fine print is. Can you take yours out?
Yeah.
Okay. And go into Settings. And then once you're in Settings, remember the acronym GAL, like this gal came and spoke to us tonight. So once you're in Settings, scroll down just a little ways and tap General. That's the G in GAL. Okay. Then up at the top, hit About. That's the A. And then scroll all the way down to Legal. It's the second from the bottom. So GAL, General About Legal, once you're in Settings. And what does it say at the bottom of Legal?
RF exposure.
Yeah, it's right there in the fine print. RF exposure, which is radio frequency or two-way microwave radiation. And in that legal fine print that comes with all of our wireless technology, it says a couple of really important things. One, keep this device at a distance from your body, or you may exceed the FCC limits for public radiation exposure, which, as we'll discuss in a minute, were never even safety tested. And two, use a hands-free option because by holding that phone in the way that it's given to us, we don't realize it, perhaps, but there's 5 or 6 separate microwave radiation transmitters in there, constantly pulsing billions of cycles a second for a handshake with the nearest cell tower or router. So you've got a Wi-Fi antenna, a cellular antenna, a data antenna, a Bluetooth antenna, a locator, and by now a public hotspot because they're using us as the network. So I think when Ashland Public Schools in Massachusetts read that legal fine print, they realized that they had legal responsibility. And so Ashland became the first in the United States to put a little sign up like this that says, turn off the Wi-Fi when not in use, turn off those devices when not in use, and never put a device on your body. And so we have these laminated and hanging all throughout our school district, but they're actually waiting for higher authorities to tell them what to do before they actually choose safe technology for our children. So what we'll do tonight is we'll go through what the non-industry funded, peer-reviewed, published scientific literature states. We'll talk about how wireless actually came to market with no safety testing. Then we'll look at what 5G is and what small cell installations are. And then we'll talk about international and domestic actions that are happening right now that lead to some pretty good examples that the rest of us can follow. And then we'll talk about community-level solutions for safe technology. And then even device-specific. What can we do to still use technology but not expose ourselves to this microwave radiation? So in November, our own government finished up a $30 million study that had been going on for nearly 2 decades. And at the time that they started it, cell phones were the technology of the day, right? So they went in expecting to prove that cell phones are safe. And instead what they found is clear evidence of tumors in the heart of these male rats. And we do studies on these rats because what happens to a biological organism of a rat happens to a biological organism of a human and a plant and everything else. So heart tumors with additional evidence of brain tumors and then additional evidence, some evidence of adrenal gland tumors, and it goes on from there, DNA damage, thyroid issues. Clear evidence is the highest public warning that the U.S. National Toxicology Program can give, and that is the top toxicology group in the world. And we should have all heard about this, but it doesn't get out in mainstream media. And some would say, well, that's just one study. You have to have additional studies to prove that it's harmful. Well, right on the heels of the NTP study, the National Toxicology Program study, the Ramazzini Institute in Italy came out with another large study that backed up everything the NTP study said. So we don't have to wait for more science to understand this. We owe a debt of gratitude to Dr. Martin Pall. He's a professor emeritus out of Washington State. And he has culled the scientific literature and all the reviews that have been done. So a review will take multiple studies and assess what the risks are. Dr. Pall has summarized 8 areas of biological evidence of harm. It attacks our nervous systems, including our brains, leading to widespread neurological and neuropsychiatric effects. And it attacks our endocrine, our hormonal systems. And it produces oxidative stress and free radical damage, which has essentially a role in all chronic disease. It attacks the very DNA of our cells, producing single-strand and double-strand breaks in cellular DNA. And these, in turn, produce mutations in the germline. And we should all understand that in the mice studies, after being exposed to radiofrequency radiation for 5 generations, the germline dies out. And for anybody who's looked at what our United States sperm counts are right now, we are down 50%. So we are right there at that line where we cannot reproduce ourselves. It also produces elevated levels of apoptosis or programmed cell death. And it lowers male and female fertility, lowers sex hormones, and lowers libido, and increases levels of spontaneous abortion. Kaiser Permanente just did a study last year on the miscarriages. And it produces excessive intracellular calcium, and calcium signaling is critical to all of the systems in our body. And it also attacks the cells of our bodies directly that can lead to cancer. And so we now know the mechanisms of harm. We know there are at least 4 ways that this radiation damages us. So in a controlled medical setting, we use microwave radiation to stimulate stem cell growth, to stimulate bone growth. But in this uncontrolled way that we're now surrounded by it, it's also encouraging other cells to grow that we don't want to grow. So if it's not directly causing cancers, it can cause additional mutations that cause other cancers to grow more rapidly. So right now, radiofrequency radiation, as of 2011, was declared a Group 2B possible human carcinogen by the World Health Organization. And that's the middle of the 5 classifications that they give. Once it gets bumped up to possible or known human carcinogen, our governments are supposed to be taking actions. Dr. Anthony Miller, Lloyd Morgan, Iris Udasin, and Dr. Deborah Lee Davis have all been leading world scientists, experts with the World Health Organization, and they are now concluding that based on the evidence reviewed, it is our opinion that the current categorization of RFR, radiofrequency radiation, as a possible human carcinogen should be upgraded to Group 1, carcinogenic to humans. So we have the science. What we don't have is a public campaign to get ourselves, our loved ones, and our colleagues and our planet educated on this. So one of the items that's particularly troubling is that children are especially vulnerable to this form of radiation. They're not just little people. Their biological systems are still under development, their DNA is still developing, and we know scientifically this mutates DNA. And their brain has a much higher water content, so they are physiologically absorbing more radiation. Their skulls are thinner, they're absorbing more radiation into the bone of their skulls. So if you were to look at this diagram, and he's actually got a bigger view of this. Thanks, Ed.
Bigger.
So on an adult, when you put the cell phone up to your head, it's penetrating your brain about 1/3 of the ways through. When you do this with a 10-year-old child, it goes about better than 2/3 of the way through the brain. And when you put a cell phone up to the head of a 5-year-old, it's going almost all the way across the brain. So to talk a little bit about what this is doing to our environment, there's a Dr. Cindy Russell out of the Santa Clara Medical Association out in California. And she wrote a really good article called Wireless Silent Spring. And for anybody who leaves us your email address, I'll be sending all this information out to you with links to everything. So don't take my word on any of this. Do your own independent investigation and then decide what you'd like to do with that information. So when we think about our wildlife and what's been happening over the last couple of decades, we know that we shouldn't have neonicotinoids out there. We know we shouldn't have glyphosate and the other chemicals that have been dumped into our planet and our food sources and such. But when we start looking at what this additional layer of radio frequency is doing to our wildlife, we have things like birds who are traveling by night, and they are, their navigation systems are electromagnetic, and they're very sensitive to the Earth's electromagnetic field, and that's what they use to navigate where they're going, right? And now we've layered on all this electrosmog that can cause them to lose their way. Or when we have cell towers on at night that have this red beaconing signal, they swap out that one on the ground for the one up in the sky, and they either smack right into it and drop dead right from there, or they get caught up in the wires, or they can't figure out what that light is and they fly around till they drop dead out of exhaustion. So it's not good for our birds. It's not good for our bees, whose little navigation systems are overwrought with this constant emission of microwave radiation. And this is all in the scientific literature as well. So they're not finding their way back to the hive. We have other studies about the fish. We have other studies about the plants. And we have something inside our own biology called the voltage-gated calcium channels. And it turns out plants have a similar mechanism. And in the humans, when this constant pulse of microwave radiation is hitting our cells, it causes a leakage at the cell wall. And when that comes out, it creates a chemical reaction that produces a really nasty free radical called peroxynitrite. And when we look at something like glyphosate or the other agricultural chemicals, we know that the downstream effect of that also can produce this free radical peroxynitrite. So that's what's happening in humans. And when you've got peroxynitrite in your system, it might go to you for breast cancer, to you for brain cancer, to you for infertility, and on down the line. What we're learning with the plants is that it messes with their calcium channels too. And so as plants always do, they've got mechanisms to protect themselves, right? Well, what the plants will do is express terpene, which sounds an awful lot like turpentine, and they will shield their outer layers with this terpene. And one plant will communicate a threat to another, so it kind of spreads. And now you've got all this foliage out there that's basically primed for fires, right? So when we start seeing wildfires that are getting out of control, this may be an area that we need to be investigating as well. So when we talked about the human biology, we talked about the peroxynitrite, we talked about the use of this technology in medicine for good things. Another thing that it does is it causes our blood cells to magnetize, and so what should be free-floating throughout our systems to oxygenate all of our organs is starting to stack up in some people like a roll of coins, and it creates this rouleau effect. And then those glommed up things can't get through our systems to oxygenate where it needs to be oxygenated. And then the fourth thing that we know of is that as part of our circadian rhythm, in the wee hours of darkness, the pineal gland in the brain is meant to release melatonin. And melatonin's got a couple of really important jobs. One is to regulate our sleep cycle, right? The other is to be a cleanup mechanism. So take those toxins out of our body and escort them out, right? On a daily basis. So now if you think about what we might be sleeping with at home, maybe we've got our cell phone in bed or on the nightstand, maybe an iPad, maybe the decked cordless phone is another high emitter. Maybe you've got Roku or Chromecast in your bedroom. Maybe there's a smart meter 3 feet from your head. But all of that radiation does this to our brains all night long. And so it never thinks it's dark. It sees this as the lights are on, and it impairs our body's mechanisms for cleanup and our sleep cycle. So we now know all this scientifically. And the industry spun it for years. Well, there's no mechanism of harm identified. Well, we've advanced. We know what the harm is. So I'll walk you through how this came to market. So meet Sam. Sam is a specific anthropomorphic mannequin. He's modeled after an adult male, 90th percentile military fitness, 220 pounds, 6'2". And what they did is they put some gel, water-based gel, inside Sam's head, and then they stuck a probe in it. And on the other end of the probe, they put a cell phone somewhere near Sam's head and said, how much heat from this one antenna in here does it take to raise the temperature of the gel inside Sam's head? So these are just strictly engineering, physics principles. Has nothing to do with a person or a baby or a child or a senior citizen or a pregnant woman or anybody with an existing health condition. And we now know scientifically those are especially vulnerable subpopulations. But here's Sam. They set up our FCC guidelines. We don't even have standards. Our FCC guidelines for how much radiation we can put out to the public based on the gel inside Sam's head. And they didn't even put the phone right up to his ear. They left a distance because the industry knew they could get that to market just based on heat. Now there's something called PhoneGate out of France where they're actually doing the testing. If you put that cell phone up to your head, you're exceeding those FCC limits, which were never safety tested to begin with, by 3 to 4 times. So this is what they did. And then some of you may recall back in the 90s, Dr. David Perlmutter was a neurosurgeon, and his patient died of these unusual tumors on the side of her head that lined up with the antennas in her cell phone. And he or the husband got on Larry King Live and said, and they line up with the antennas on her cell phone, and stock prices started doing this. So the industry said, well, this is terrible. You know, we have the means, let us do the research. And so with our government, they set up this wireless technology research program. They put Dr. George Carlo in charge of that program. He hired 200 scientists, and for years they did the studies. Dr. Carlo reported back to the head of the industry that this probably is what killed that woman, and children are especially vulnerable. And instead of protecting the public and choosing the precautionary principle, they got the Telecom Act passed in 1996, which they pretty much wrote, the industry. And the head of the industry association at that time, the Cellular Telephone Industry Association, which has now rebranded itself, it calls itself CTIA, the wireless industry, that was Tom Wheeler. And Tom Wheeler grew up to become not only the head of the CTIA, but the head of the cable industry prior to that, and then he became our FCC chairman. So in my work with this, in my investigation, and for 2 years I didn't have anybody I could talk to about this, so I'm just, using my research skills and seeing, why doesn't somebody have our backs on this? If this science looks as bad as I'm finding, surely somebody's protecting us, right? And then in 2015, Harvard University Law School Center for Ethics put out a 59-page report called Captured Agency, How the Federal Communications Commission is dominated by the industries it presumably regulates. And there are documents showing that other organizations at our federal level are also captured agencies. So this was my missing piece. This showed me that they are basically using the big tobacco playbook, whereby if you can suppress evidence of harm, which in our country they've done especially successfully, because if you look to see who owns all of our mainstream media, a lot of it rolls right up to the telecom industry or the cable industry or the parent organizations that own those. Or when you listen to your radio and TV, it could be kind of fun, start counting how many telecom ads you hear, right? Our networks can't afford to bite the hand that feeds them. So we don't get this, by and large, in the public mainstream media. There are some things that the industry would probably rather we not know. Lloyd's of London, Swiss Re, and others have already for years recognized this as a leading risk, and they put exclusions in their policies to say we will not cover damage from radio frequency. So just like the little fine print disclaimer we looked at earlier, when they come into your town now and say 5G, autonomous vehicles, smart cities, what that means is that they're going to pair that with the existing infrastructure. So we started with cell towers 300 feet in the air in the industrial parks, right? And now when we look around, it's encroached closer and closer. So long as they can paint it the same color as the building, they'll put it up on a building. So long as they can make it look like a tree, they'll stick it out somewhere. That's the antennas we have, the big macro cell antennas. But they've maxed out pretty much the new revenue that can be made off of that. So what's left of the electromagnetic spectrum, down here are the radio waves, the TV waves, which for a long time were analog waves, right? And unless you were standing right under the towers and getting a whomping dose, our bodies could acclimate to that pretty well. When we got into digital technology, on top of that rolling continuous sine wave, we added a square wave. And it's a square wave that's carrying our data packets back and forth with our wireless signals. And that square wave does this, pulses erratically, spiked, pulsing billions of cycles a second. And that's what's harming our biological cells. So in this segment, we have the microwaves, which is what all wireless is. Cell phones, cell towers, smart meters, Wi-Fi, microwave ovens, baby monitors, gaming devices, decked cordless phones, radar, all of that. And we've kind of used up the best spectrum in that area. What's left are these, and of course over here with the sun and the x-rays and stuff, we know very limited exposure. You wouldn't leave a kid outside for an entire day out in the sun, right? You wouldn't go in and into an x-ray machine and just hang out, right? Well, we're kind of on a Wi-Fi honeymoon, but now we get to figure it out and come back and do something. But what's left of this spectrum here are these dinky little millimeter waves. And that's what they're proposing to use for 5G and the Internet of Things. And they're spinning it that we're going to have these vast quantities of data and we're going to get really fast download speeds. But the millimeter waves can't travel very far. And they're not very good at going through stuff either, like a leaf or a rain or a building, whereas 3G and 4G right now go through everything just fine. They're longer waves. These dinky little waves will require a whole lot more cell towers. And instead of being far away from us, what they want to do is put them inside our neighborhoods, every 2 to 12 houses. Sometimes you'll find them on utility poles like this. Sometimes they'll integrate them into a light pole. Sometimes they'll extend an existing pole and mount it up on top. I just read an article in England where they're starting to hide them in the manhole covers, right? Stick them under there. I've heard that to get around the permitting process with perhaps a pole and conduit committee, they're now making them so they can hang them on the wires so they don't have to go in for permitting. So these can just show up in your backyard and your front yard without any say. And if it's not bad enough what we're doing on the ground, they're also looking to hang thousands of these from the sky. So there will be nowhere we can go without exposure to toxic radio frequency microwave radiation. And right now there's some pushback happening with our weather scientists because all this electromagnetic pollution is interfering with the weather systems that they've already got up in the satellites. And if we can no longer predict the weather, then we have a lot of trouble. So there is a lot of pushback going on in courts around the world. There are lawsuits already being won because people are being harmed. This one's out of Italy where, ironically, a telecom worker was made to use his cell phone and he wound up with the tumors on the side of his brain. And he was awarded compensation. There have been others in Grenoble, France, who were compensated for the smart meter damage. And here in Massachusetts, we have a federal lawsuit at the Fay School, which is a very prestigious international boarding school where, like, Saudi princes send their children to be educated. There's a little boy at the Fay School around age 10 who kept winding up in the nurse's office with headaches, nosebleeds, nausea, dizziness, anxiety. He was otherwise a happy little kid, but he was crashing. They'd take him home, take him to the doctors, they'd run the tests, come up empty. And this went on for a couple of years. And then as he was headed towards 7th grade, the parents recognized that on school break or summer vacation, everything kind of took care of itself, and he was fine. And within a day or two of being back at the Fay School, all those symptoms came slamming back. So they're like, well, what is it? So they started investigating the symptoms, and it didn't take them very long to figure out that this sounds like microwave sickness, or what today is called electrical sensitivity or electrohypersensitivity. And they discovered that most of our doctors have never been trained on this, so you would need to get an environmental health specialist, which we were fortunate to have a couple in Massachusetts. So they got a diagnosis, went to the school and said, we believe, and our doctor believes, that it's this industrial strength mesh Wi-Fi network in the school that's making our son sick. Could we please ask for accommodations and just hardwire the 10 classrooms that are now 7th grade child is going to need to be in. And unfortunately, the Fay School administration is more known to disenroll families who raise any kind of an issue at the next fall. So they were denied. And so the parents went and met with some scientists, and they outfitted the boy with a dosimeter, which is what medical professionals will wear to monitor their own exposures when they're administering microwave therapies. So they hook him up with a dosimeter. They also outfit him with a high-end radio frequency detection meter that measures and records. And so throughout the day, as he went about his classrooms, his biological symptoms and the spikes in radiation went like this. So they come back a second time. Could we please ask for accommodations? They were turned down again. They come back a third time. We're fortunate to have the means. Could we please just pay out of pocket to hardwire the 10 classrooms that our son needs to be in so he can access his education? And again, they were refused. Now, the Americans with Disabilities Act already recognizes electrical sensitivities. And so they have brought a federal lawsuit on the Fay School with the ADA. And it's been going on since 2015. And one really important thing that happened is when the scientists and the doctors came in to testify, they had enough solid scientific evidence to show that there is biological harm at the non-thermal level. You don't need to have heat to have harm. There's a whole lot of other stuff going on. So we allow this much, but we have thousands of studies showing biological effects at hundreds of thousands of times below that. And that was the first time in a U.S. court that the non-thermal effects were recognized. They're still trying to firmly establish that it was that caused him to be ill, but that was critical that they recognize the non-thermal effects. So a bit of good news is there are a number of bills out there. Massachusetts is leading the nation. We've got 19 bills. My Senator Spilka introduced a bill on my behalf, and we don't move very fast in our legislature. We have 2-year sessions, and she introduced a bill on my behalf in 2015. It actually made some progress. The Committee on Public Health reported it out favorably, but then it got bundled up and sent to study at the next committee level. She brought it back last session under her own name, which was great, and it once again passed Public Health, because when these bills were coming up for hearing, I created a template and asked everybody I could find, from scientists to doctors to public health experts to people who are ill from this to concerned citizens to public servants, please send in testimony to say we've got to get ahead of this. So Senator Spilka is now our Senate president in Massachusetts and can no longer introduce legislation. But my state rep brought my bill back, and I'm so grateful. And he brushed it up to include 5G in it this time, too. So we actually have 19 bills in Massachusetts to address various aspects of man-made radiation. New Hampshire has an excellent bill right now with Representative Patrick Abrami. They move really swiftly there. I'm so impressed. Their committees have already been formed. The bill was assigned to the House Committee. I think it was Science, Technology, and Energy. I came up to testify. The retired president of Microsoft Canada, Frank Clegg, is a whistleblower on this. He flew in to testify. Dr. Paul Elroux out of McGill University is a medical school teacher, professor, and researcher, and he came in to testify, and they reported that bill out favorably on the floor from the House. It's now with the Senate, and they put it into Health and Human Services, which is really where this belongs. And we're hopeful that it'll pass there, too. So other states, Oregon, Montana, Maryland, a bunch of them have legislation. So that would be a good thing for us all to do. We're very, very pleased that the first U.S. healthcare conference on this is going to happen in September out in Santa Cruz, California at 1440 Multiversity. So this is something you can share with your own medical teams, doctors, nurses, social workers, everybody, alternative healers, everybody is welcome to register for this conference. And we are flying in the world's leading scientists and doctors to teach us what microwave radiation is doing, how to diagnose it, how to treat it, and how to educate our families. So we're very pleased that that's finally happening. And I know we're getting short on time, but I wanted to share with you, to help your towns, there's a policy paper that has come out of Washington, D.C. from the National Institute for Science, Law, and Public Policy called Reinventing Wires, the Future of Landlines and Networks. Because we are way behind the rest of the world here. We're still using wireless, which is slow. If we're honest with ourselves, it's pretty crummy technology. Your signal isn't reliable, the speed is lousy. But when you hardwire with an Ethernet cable, like we did 10 years ago, plug it into the back of your router, then you can plug your devices in on the other end, and then just go into the router and turn off those wireless antennas. And I didn't know how to do that. So I called up my internet service provider, and they said, oh, sit down at your computer, and we'll walk you through it. And I'm like, wow, I can do this from my computer, right? So they showed me how to set up my account online, and I just went into wireless settings. And there it was. There was a 2.4 gigahertz antenna in the triple play box that came, you know, cable, internet, and telephone. There was a 2.4 gigahertz antenna, and there was a 5 gigahertz antenna. I didn't know I had two of them in there. So I just went off, apply, and then I went and measured, and all the radiation was gone. So in my house, we have hardwired all of our technology. My PC, my own PC, is my work tool because I'm a writer. That's always been hardwired. But I had switched over to a wireless mouse, a wireless keyboard, so I went and dug out my old good ones, plugged them back in, and then I went into my computer and turned off the wireless signal that was in my computer. So my daughters like the Apple products, and I figured out that even though they've gotten so skinny that they don't have an Ethernet jack in them anymore, you can actually buy adapters. So this one's the Thunderbolt to Gigabit Ethernet adapter for, I don't know, $20 or $30. You just plug that into your Ethernet cable and then plug it into your device, and you have good technology. And you can actually do that. This is for their MacBooks, but you can actually do it for the iPhone and the iPad as well. So I mentioned I had my 15-year-old daughter who I was trying to keep safe, and I finally figured out through some nice videos on YouTube how to hardwire a cell phone. And I bring home this adapter. It's a Lightning to RJ45 Ethernet LAN network adapter. And I go to my daughter, who's sitting on the couch doing her homework with her cell phone for 3 hours a night right there next to her. I said, okay, sweetie, plug this in. And, you know, she's giving me the eye roll. I said, come on. And so she plugs it in, and I say, now go into your phone and turn off all those antennas. Oftentimes, if you just choose to put your device in airplane mode, it'll disable everything. But double check, because sometimes they'll pop back on with updates or something. So she turns everything off, and she's plugged in, and I say, okay, do something. And she does, and she goes, wow, it's so much faster. And I went, yeah, because I know it's faster. I know the signal's more reliable. I know her data's not flying through the air to be hacked. I know it's much more energy efficient to use hardwiring, because wireless and all of our data storage and everything uses like 10 times more energy than hardwiring. So then I saw the light go off, and she said, so if I'm hardwired, does this mean that the signal's going through here and it's not eating into my data plan? I went, that's right, because if she goes over budget, we make her pay out of pocket. So that's how I got a teenager to buy into this, at least when we're at home. And then when she's on the go, I encourage her to only have on the antenna that she needs. So most kids don't even talk on the phone anymore. So turn off the cellular antenna. If you're only texting, just have the texting antenna on, right? You don't need the hotspot. You don't need the Wi-Fi. You don't need the Bluetooth. You don't need the locator. Just learn to be judicious. And when you're not using it, turn it all off and never, ever put it on your body if it's active. So hardwiring in our homes can be done. It's not rocket science, but you have to learn a little bit, right? And in our communities, hardwiring is the solution. So fiber optics, Don't let them just run it down your street, though, because if they just do that, that means they're going to come in and pop up with wireless nodes. And we don't want that in our neighborhoods, right? You don't want small cell antennas. So make sure that they're putting hardwiring to the premises, so fiber to the premises. That's the end game. And only as much power coming out of that fiber as we actually need. We don't want to blast our homes with more than what we need anyway, right? So we're in a good place today because we have some amazing resources that everybody can learn from. There's an award-winning film out called Generation Zapped, and we've had screenings all over Massachusetts. We actually had one at the State House. I was asked to co-chair a technology panel at the Health and Buildings Roundtable down at the NIH last summer. We got the producer to let us show it on a continuous loop down there. This is a really nice way to open this conversation with your community and your loved ones. It's 74 minutes. It's got the world's leading scientists, doctors, public health experts, people who have become ill from this in a lovely way. Sabine El-Jamail is a wonderful filmmaker. It's not fear-mongering. It just puts the information in there in a way that we can digest and start an important conversation. All right. Any questions I can help you with?
What about that little rechargeable electric toothbrush that I put on the stand to charge at night? It's not making metal-to-metal contact while it's charging. Is that an example?
Yeah, so the question was, what about the electric toothbrush? I have a hunch that if there was any harm from that, it might just be dirty electricity, which is another thing we should be concerned about. But if it's not sending data to a device, then it probably doesn't have a radio frequency transmitter in it. And you should have seen me when I first fell down the rabbit hole with this. I was like, what about this little Yahtzee game I'm playing, you know? Is that harmful? What about the button I push to open up the garage door? Is that harmful? But once you get a device that measures microwave radiation, then you can answer those questions. So I invested, after I took a big gulp, I invested about $400 and bought what's called an acoustimeter. There are others that you can get for a couple $100s or less. But I like this one because it's big enough that people across the room can see it. And if there were no radio frequency in here, when I turn this on, it would just crackle a little, confirming it's working. If we see the light indicator is green, that's where the science is still discovering what the biological effects are. When it goes into yellow, that's where those symptoms of microwave sickness start happening. People aren't sleeping well. They feel anxious or depressed or suicidal ideation. They might have cognitive impairment, memory issues, erratic heartbeats. They might have skin things because we have little antennas in our skin that react to this microwave radiation. They might have nausea because it's affecting the mast cells in the gut. So that's the yellow. When we go into red, we literally have thousands of studies linking this to all of that, plus the bigger chronic things like cancers for children and adults, like neurotoxicity, genotoxicity, infertility. So here in this room, it's called the acoustimeter because we can hear these various signals. And that jumping up and down that it's doing, that's those spiked erratic pulses of microwave radiation going back and forth. So it's kind of a cool device to have because you never know where they're putting these antennas. So I thought I had my house completely sealed, right? So my daughter comes home from college and she asked if she could please turn on the Wi-Fi because she needed to download something. And I said, yeah, turn it on, then turn it right back off. And she was a swim instructor. She taught swim lessons in our pool in the backyard during college. And after she goes back to college, I'm sitting in my office and I'm working, and after about 2 hours, I'm like, why do I feel like the earth is sucking me down again? I slept great last night. I ate a clean organic breakfast. I didn't power up on sugar. So I turned on my meter, and it went into the red zone, and I'm like, what? And it was my printer. And on the front of it, it's got a little light that glows when the Wi-Fi is on, right? And I'm like, well, it's not on. Why is it doing that? So I just looked up the manual online, and it turns out there were 2 antennas in that, too. Yes?
So, CC, I have the smaller version.
The Acousticom.
too, and it doesn't have a digital readout, but it's useful. And I had wondered about an Infinity superstation in my neighborhood, so I went and knocked on the people's door, and they indeed do have a rented router, and I mean it's a massive signal.
It is.
It's part of the Xfinity business plan, but it does seem like Xfinity and Comcast can sort of bamboozle people into not really spelling this out, and so wherever you see an Xfinity super signal, that's somebody is voluntarily supporting that business by putting out a supercharged signal. But I wonder, in terms of the 5G, like that seems like one level of problem that people are unaware of. But on the 5G level, if a neighborhood gets together and is clear, I mean, and how do you, and do towns have to disclose like where these things are going, so that citizens can actually make a decision and say, as a community, like, we're not going to allow it in our neighborhood somehow,
Right.
or get the word out.
So that's excellent insight and questioning. I'm going to paraphrase because the microphone's up here and it might
Yeah,
not pick up
right.
on video. But thank you for saying that you've seen that Xfinity signal throughout your neighborhood.
Well, on town, too. Everywhere.
Yeah, and townwide. And the question is there anything a community can do to stave off these small cell antennas? And I would encourage you to find a good answer for that. There is a wonderful group of people at Grassroots Environmental Education out of New York. They put up a couple of good websites. One is Americans for Responsible Technology. And on the 15th of May, which is next week, they're encouraging communities to stage a rally outside of your telecom companies, so the Verizon store or AT&T or Comcast or whomever, and start getting that public education out there. They also have a good fact sheet that's on their website by the Environmental Health Trust. That is a 2-pager that you can use to start talking about this issue in your community. Well, it's out there. And they also have a couple of letters that you can use to go door to door and say, we're learning that this is a biological threat to ourselves, our children, and our planet. Would you like to get together for a meeting? So definitely organize at the community level and then go to your town boards, because it's awfully hard for a town to say no when you've got 50 people in the room staring at you saying, we don't want this in our... But we also have to understand that the way the industry has set this up with our laws, it makes it very difficult for them to say no based on health or environmental concerns. They actually wrote that into the Telecom Act, Section 704, that you cannot claim environmental harm. And over the years, they've sort of interpreted that to include human harm, too. But that's not to say you can't do what Burlington, Massachusetts did and make it so uncomfortable for them or so expensive for them that they're not going to want to put this here. And I'd like to think we're getting closer to a tipping point. When you have Geneva and Brussels and Rome and other areas saying no, and when you have Senator Blumenthal and other high-level politicians saying, we need biological facts on this. So we could be getting closer to a tipping point, but don't ever think that anybody's going to fix this for you. You have got to stand up, because this is how our democracy was built. So, thank you. Yes?
Let's go back 70 years at least, when X-ray was just a toy.
Right.
And I stuck my feet in that
In the
little
shoe store.
What?
In the shoe store. Right. So we're just at one point in time. We've been on this all Wi-Fi all the time honeymoon, and like this gentleman said, when he was a little kid, you'd go into the shoe store to get fitted for shoes, and they would X-ray your foot.
And you could
Which
sit
today
down
sounds
there as long as you
ludicrous.
wanted to.
But you can imagine the health issues that were perpetuated from that. So we're just at one point in time. We haven't had this around long enough to have good public policy around it in our country. And our country, by and large, was one of the first inventors of this. And so there's a lot at risk financially. But as Frank Clegg from Microsoft Canada said, the industry can do better. They just need a nudge. And they can make it faster, more reliable, safer, and it'll bring a whole nother economic boom, right? But they need a push. So that's our job. Yes.
Can you clarify again, when fiber optic is coming down Pleasant Street here in town, they're necessarily wiring businesses on Pleasant Street. They could also be putting cables in that, say, another company like Verizon could be putting small cells on, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that
Yeah, once that fiber optic backbone comes in,
right.
we need to have it go all the way to the premises and not stop short where they're going to throw up small cell antennas.
5G is a double-edged sword, sort of. Yes,
Yeah.
if you get into that high-speed stuff, it's fast, but it also is integral to, well, the super cable. It's very fast, but it's also integral to the 5G.
Yeah, another item you might want to discuss with your towns is where are we with the copper landlines,
Yeah.
right? Our phone lines, they're gone?
They're going.
They're going.
Because DSL is
Yeah.
now, I lost my DSL and I had to buy something expensive
Mm-hmm.
because they were putting those fiber optics right into the house whether you wanted them or not.
Yeah, and I remember when we would lose power in a winter storm, I still had a landline that worked. And now we've been switched over, and the battery on that, you know,
What do you mean you don't have a LAN? You don't have copper anymore?
they're switching the copper out and going with whatever they're putting in, be it cable or...
And then your phone, it will work on copper?
When you lose
So
electrical,
internet or
when you lose electrical, you lose it all now. And that is a
They
public
can't
safety
take it.
hazard.
They're taking it, like I still have a landline and still have.
Yeah, I use my landline at home. We've bought a backup power source, so should we lose electricity, it will
Yeah.
keep us powered for a few hours. But one time, we lost our power for 36 hours. What are you going to do? What if you have somebody at home who's having an emergency? You haven't been able to charge your cell phone. What are you going to do?
Sheer falling.
So there's many reasons, not just health, to encourage our towns and our governments to go back to hardwired technology. And this is free, it's online, and for anybody who leaves us your email address, like I said, I'll send out a document that has links to all these things that we've discussed tonight. So I know it's a lot to get your heads around, so freak out for 10 minutes, but then just know there are solutions.
There's an excellent website called Scientists for Wire Technology
Yeah.
on the West Coast. It's also
Yeah.
an incredible resource.
Yeah, that's Paul McGavin's site, and he's done a wonderful job with that. Ma'am?
Yeah, I think this is off the topic, because when he asked about electric toothbrush, you made reference that dismissed it in his context to dirty electricity. What is that?
So, I'm not an engineer, but when we have an imbalance of the electrical currents coming in and out, and if they're not properly grounded to discharge it out, sometimes we have this imbalance that creates an electromagnetic field, not the digital pulse of radiation that we're talking about, but it creates a dirty electricity field that emanates into your house like 6 or 8 feet off the walls even, if your wires are not properly grounded. And that's one of the issues with the utility smart meters, is that they typically are not grounded. And so now this radio frequency can hop on your home wires or your pipes and kind of radiate your whole home. So, yeah, dirty electricity is a bad thing too. That in itself can be carcinogenic.
It's a colloquial phrase for bad power quality.
Yeah.
And there are power quality engineers, and if you're doing precise electronics, whether music industry, sound recording, things like that, or more, it's really important that dirty electricity be taken care of or filtered out. And most of what we get it from these days is when we're using DC appliances, things that run on direct current, but our grid is alternating current. Anytime you have a black box, like on your computer wire, or the smart meters actually run on DC, anytime there's that conversion, it screws up that nice, even sine wave and puts static onto it.
The dirty sort of CFLs.
Yes,
Yeah, those swirly light bulbs, those are really bad. And actually, if I can share a little story with you before we wrap up, in our public library, when the energy industry was pushing those little swirly light bulbs to save energy, one of their marketing campaigns was to put a kilowatt meter in our library. So I think they donated them largely to libraries all over the place. And I had seen that, and I thought, wouldn't it be great to get a RF meter on loan in our library? So I went after a grant. The Boston Marathon runs through our town, and we get bibs from the association that organizes that. And then people take them and do fundraising and run the marathon. And then we've got this nice pot of community funding that our selectmen decides through applications who gets what. So I thought, cool, let's get a meter for the schools, let's get one for our library, and then everybody can just go measure. You have data, and now you can figure out what you want to do with it, right? Simple enough, right? So I submit my application. They say, oh, we really don't know. Come back next time. So 6 months later, I reapply, and they say, ooh, probably more of a Board of Health issue. And I'd already met with our health agent in our town, and he didn't know. So then my bill came up for public hearing with Senator Spilka, and I got to testify in 3 minutes. I'm holding up the science, I'm holding up Ashland's best practices, I'm holding up my meter, and I'm watching the Public Health Committee, and I could tell not one single person had any idea this issue existed. And so I thought, uh-oh. So over the next 6 to 9 months, I met with every single member of that committee and the committees to which a couple other bills had been assigned. And I realized you have to educate somebody for an hour or so before they can really understand what this issue is. And then I thought, whoa, I better go back to my town and educate there. So I asked for individual meetings with my selectmen. And one came to my home. I went to another's home where 2 of them met me. I met another one in a coffee shop. I met another one in a restaurant. So one by one, I educated them. And then I reapplied. And they said, well, they're still a little nervous about this, right? They said, well, we will give you funding for 1 meter conditionally, and that's that the library agrees to take it into circulation. And I thought, okay. So I got on the agenda for the trustees at the library, and one gentleman was very firm that this is all basically hogwash, and he didn't want it. Another one couldn't wait to get her hands on it and take it home and measure. And a third one said, well, regardless of how we feel personally, as a public library, we are a conduit of information for our community, and because we already had this 1 kilowatt meter on loan, that's what gave me the idea to put one of these on loan. So we already knew how to put one into circulation, right? So they voted 4-1. I was given the grant. I ordered the meter, wrote up a little bit of instruction for it, and anybody in my town can now take this out for a week, measure their home, measure their loved ones, take it to school, take it to work, see what's going on in your car. And I've heard that somebody in the Carolinas has donated one now to their library. Somebody in Belmont, Massachusetts wants to donate one. So that's something that collectively you could do as a community, is make the resources available. So, any other questions? All right. Well, you guys have been great. Thanks so much. I know it's a lot. And like I said, freak out for 10 minutes and then come back.